All right, welcome back. I'm Cullen. We're gonna go ahead and keep on going through our fantastic HTML5 voyage here. We're coming back with Module 7 of HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals. And that means that we're going to review how to manage a graphical interface using CSS. More specifically, we're gonna check out how to implement graphic effects and also look at 2D and 3D transformations, which are super fun. And I do mean super. All right, so some new effects in CSS3. You can now round corners on objects, which is exciting, right? You can make things transparent with ease. This is 50% transparent over here. You can also give things shadows, like this lovely rectangle here. And then you can also animate objects as well, right? Like this circle. I thought I'd throw a circle in there for good measure. Just like that, right? Make them bounce out of here. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started and talk about how to implement these graphic effects. You can create rounded corners with just a couple of properties, actually one property more specifically. But you can also modify and round individual corners. So you use the border radius property along with the length value such as pixels, ems, or a percentage. And the higher that pixel value is, the more rounded the corners will appear. Okay. Keep in mind that some browsers are going to have problems with rendering a percentage value, so it's probably a better idea to stick with pixels and ems when placing units in there. Like I mentioned, you can also go ahead and round individual corners with the border top left radius property and border top right, border bottom right, and then border bottom left. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at how you do that in Web Matrix. Okay. So real quickly here, just got some basic code. I'm gonna drop this guy down to show a little bit more code on my screen. Probably should have done that earlier, huh? Oh wow, the things you forget when you get old. So here, we're gonna go ahead and identify a block. This guy right here is the div, it's block 1. We've got hello world, I am a block. We're actually gonna use this code to show you how to round borders. And we're also gonna go ahead and show you how to use gradients too, but that comes in just a little bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna change the class here to my rounded class. I'm going to save my file and let's take a look at the CSS real quickly. Note that the border radius here set just as in our example of 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels. I gave it a shadow and I'm not going to let you guys see that shadow yet. That's not fair. I'm going to comment that out. And then of course the background of this square or this block is going to be yellow. Okay, so let's launch it in the browser. And there it is. Uh-oh. Got a little bit of a rendering problem there. Our text is sticking outside of our block. And actually I can go ahead and fix that real quickly here. I'm going to add some padding. We talked about that a little bit earlier when we reviewed the CSS box model. I'm gonna go ahead and add, let's do 15 pixels and see what that does for us, okay? Let's go back to our browser. Whoops. All right, let's go ahead and refresh the page and see what happens. And there we go. We fixed our problem, right? Hello world, I am a block is no longer cut off by our awesome rounded corners. So pretty easy stuff, right? I know you've been probably adding rounded corners to your shapes in PowerPoint for years. And now CSS finally allows you to catch up in your web documents a little bit more easily as well, right? All right, so let's talk about creating shadows. So let's go back to this slide right here, right? Our friend with the shadow, that's what we're gonna do. It may not look exactly like that, but gosh darn it, we're gonna try. All right, so you can add drop shadows to elements using the box shadow property. A drop shadow is just a visual effect that makes an object appear like it's floating, sort of like light is shining on the object, and then providing a shadow in the background, right? There are 6 different attributes that can be modified when using the box shadow property, and those are H shadow, which is your horizontal positioning of the shadow, or how far off how far off from the shape itself the shadow is horizontally. The vertical shadow, which is how far off the shadow is vertically from the shape. Then you have your blur level, your spread, and then your color. And then finally you have inset as well. Today we're gonna go ahead and show you just H shadow, V shadow, blur, and then color as well, okay? All right, real quick overview of each of those different attributes. Give you a couple of seconds to take a look at that. Don't forget that you can download these slides as well and go ahead and review these. Quick Bing search never hurts to just search for box shadow attributes, CSS. All right, let's go ahead and demo that shadow now. I'll finally go back and uncomment the box shadow. Let's add a beautiful shadow to our lovely rounded block here. Okay, so all I did was I've got the box shadow property. I've added that to the rounded class, right, to the selector. And now we're gonna go ahead and offset it horizontally by 10 pixels, vertically by 10 pixels, blur it by 8 pixels, and then go ahead and use the 80-80-80 hexadecimal code. And that should give me some variant of gray. Of course, we'll see. If I'm wrong, don't hold it against me. So I'm gonna refresh here, and there it is. Pretty cool. So now what happens if I make these H shadow values negative? I'm gonna go ahead and save my file. I always kind of just wonder things, right? And no better way to learn than to experiment. Here I've got, I'm gonna X out of these old windows. Still have to refresh. And if I do that, notice what happens, right? The orientation, or rather the positioning of the shadow changes. The placement of the shape on the page does not, though. Really, really important to make sure that you remember that, okay? But go and experiment with these values. Have some fun. Get wild with shadows. I don't even know if that's really possible. Anyway, let's talk about applying transparency now. All right. In addition to the rounded corners and also to shadows, we can make shapes more transparent, or rather we can add a transparency effect to a shape, right, or to an element. And so we do that with the opacity property, right? Opacity determines how transparent an object appears, and the value for this property should be somewhere between 0 and 1. And so 1 means that the object is entirely opaque. And let me just highlight this real fast, just like our friend right here. Whereas if we decrease that value, you see that it becomes more and more transparent, right? And I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second with CSS, right? Here's just a quick recap. We use that border radius, we use box shadow, and now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna add opacity, okay? Let's go with 0.2 as our value. And let's see what happens to that lovely yellow. So notice that our shadow is still there. Our shadow is also a little bit more transparent too, which I think is super interesting. I think it's really cool that we were able to do that with the opacity property. But everything else you just see. If another thing that I really want to make sure that we point out is that if you added another element and that element happened to be overlapped by this relatively transparent element, what you would see is that element in the background. And it's really, really important that you make sure that you remember that, because that overlap could cause an effect that might not be pleasing to a user. So do keep that in mind, okay? All right, and actually let me go ahead and show you really fast what that would look like. So if I find the slide that we were just on, I apologize, I don't want to take too much of your time, but if I add this and then I send this to the back, Notice that this object sits on top, and you can actually see through this object in order to see the entirely opaque shape right here. Now, if I change the color of this shape in order to further demonstrate this point, it makes it a little bit easier to see, right? If it's the same color, it doesn't really have the same effect, but you can see that this shape is overlaid on top of the shape in the background, and that's going to that could potentially rather cause some problems later on, okay? So keep in mind as you guys are developing your web pages to use opacity wisely, okay? All right. So back to our presentation. Let's talk about background gradients. A gradient is a smooth transition from one color to another. And in CSS3, you can apply gradients to just about anything, right? Headers, footers, buttons, shapes, vector graphics. They're applied through the background property, and then you actually use methods, right? So if I have the background property in use, I'm going to add in linear gradient as a value. So if I have linear gradient right here, I would add that in as a value. And then there's some other coding that I have to do in order to make best use of that method. So to give you guys an idea of how linear gradients function, they can be from the top to the bottom, from bottom to top, or from corner to corner, or even side to side. A default gradient is going to go from top to bottom, okay? How we implement this is kind of tricky. It's very different from the way that we implement a lot of our other properties within CSS3, and so the best way to explain this is to actually just show you an example, okay? So give me a quick second here and I'll switch over and we'll show you an example. All right, so we've got our code up on screen now, and I'm gonna change the class for my block from rounded to gradiented. I'm pretty sure that that's not even a word, and of course I misspelled it. I can't verify that for you, but it is important to make sure that you use names for your classes and for your IDs that aren't the same as some of the properties that you're using or some of the keywords that you'll use, right? Like you wouldn't want to make an ID for HTML called P for a P tag, or called H1 for an H1 tag. It just wouldn't be a good idea. So let's go ahead and take a look at this code though in action. I'm going to make sure I save it first. Launch the browser there. And here you have a block, right, with gradiented. Let's take a look at our CSS here, okay? And let's talk about what this does. So right now, we've got this beautiful block. It goes to top, which means that it starts from the bottom. It starts as a white, and it's completely white until it hits the 20% mark. At that point, it starts transitioning gradually to blue until it hits the 80% mark, where it's going to be entirely blue from there, okay? We can go ahead, if we change this from top to bottom and then save, I'm gonna refresh the page, and all of a sudden I flip the gradient, okay? Super cool, it's a tiny little touch. Let's take a look at a couple of other things too. If I'm not mistaken, and I might be wrong, I might have to go back and check. You can also, let's do 110 degrees. I think that you can add in a degree as a property in order to change the gradient. Yeah, and there it is, right? So I've done the same thing, but I've started up in this top left corner at 110 degrees, and then the gradient moves down towards the right corner. So pretty cool stuff. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and comment this out now. And then I'm going to uncomment this next example before I actually go on to talk about it on our presentation. All right, so next we'll talk about radial gradients, right? They start from the center of an object and then they radiate outwards. And they actually can take different shapes. They can either be like a perfect circle or they can be an ellipse, which is sort of like an oval, right? And we're talking about a rudimentary definition there. The first values with the radial gradient method are going to determine the horizontal and vertical center values, so where the gradient is going to start. So let's take a look at that in action, okay? So we're gonna use the same colors, white and blue. Sorry if that gets boring. I have no idea why I picked them, just because. All right, so I'm gonna make sure to save this, and then we're gonna pop open our browser window, and we're gonna go ahead and refresh. And there we have an awesome radial gradient. And notice I said ellipse at center, but if I change those values, let's do 10 and then 10, and let's see what happens here. Uh-oh, I messed up. Oh. Now I'm just hitting all sorts of combinations of things that I don't want to hit. All right. Let me actually go back to my presentation because I may have made a mistake, and honestly, guys, I can't recall. If you ever run into a situation like this, all I would do is stop what you're doing, go to Bing, right, bing.com, and do a quick search for the property. It'll be super helpful. You'll easily find your way out of a jam. I'm gonna move forward because sometimes that's what basically you should just do, right? And with that being said, let's move on to talk about 2D and 3D transformations. So graphic effects are awesome, but at the end of the day, you know, they're not as cool. Like I said, we've been using these in PowerPoints forever and Word documents forever. And so, you know, what is really fascinating, what is really engaging is when we add 2D and 3D transformations. So like any kind of animation or something along those lines that changes an object from its original shape or form. All right, without further ado, you know, a transform, we'll start there, the basic definition. It's an effect that lets you change the size, shape, and position of an element. This includes just basically rotating, scaling, stretching, spinning, and moving elements. To add transformations, all you have to do is add the transform property with one of its methods. An important thing to understand is that transform by itself is not going to implement an animation. In fact, you actually have to use a key, oh, I forget the name. We'll talk about it here in just a second, I promise you. I'm starting to lose it, guys. So keep following me, okay? But you don't animate, you just transform. So when you refresh a page, the element itself transforms from the way that you had it initially in its code, but a user's never going to see that transformation. Really important there. There are tons of different methods that are involved with the transform property, and we're only going to cover a few of them today, okay? Like I've said before, you know, go to Bing, look for the Microsoft Developer Network, and do a quick lookup for the transform property. It'll be super helpful. All right, so let's get started with translations. 2D translations are going to move elements without rotating, skewing, or turning the image, right? All that it does is it moves it from its original location to a brand new location. And let's go ahead and take a quick look at a demo for translations. So I'm gonna increase the size of my web matrix window, snap it, open up my transforms demo. Let's see here. And then I want you guys to see that I've actually got all of my CSS stored inside of a transforms.css file. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna walk through all these transitions, and I've actually got an animation here, so get pretty excited for that one. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna change the class each and every time. I may have to come back and check the class name to make sure I'm implementing it correctly, But this is really the benefit of using a CSS file and then linking that file to your HTML file, okay, to your HTML document. So I open this up. I'm going to double check my link to make sure that I've properly linked to my CSS file, right? Transforms.css. Note that transforms.css is in the same file folder as my transforms demo.html file, so I don't need to add a folder name. If transforms.css happened to be in, say, managing text flow, I would have to go ahead and add that name, you know, managing underscore text flow, and then a /. And that would allow me to properly link it in a different folder. So something to keep in mind for later. Not tested on the exam, but exceptionally important whenever you're creating web apps and web pages. Anyway, all right, back to the topic of transforms. I'm gonna go ahead and we want to add the translated class, okay? Because that's where my transform property is being used. All right, so I've got a square here that's going to appear on the page, and it says, of course, hi, I'm square, or I'm a square. Probably would have been funnier if it said hi, I'm square, but here what I've done is with the translated class, I've moved this element from its original position on the left all the way to the right. And if I actually just delete this class, save the file, and refresh, you see where the square was positioned initially. Okay, and so now if I go back, oops, type transform instead of translated. If I go back and I refresh the page, you see here all I've done is I've just moved it over to the right. A user's never even going to know that that happened. It's just going to be there in the code. Okay, really important piece of information to recall. All right, so moving on. Let's talk about scaling. Scaling an element, all that it does is it increases or decreases its size. Once again, we use the transform property along with the scale method, and it just accepts two basic values. It's got a factor to adjust its width and a factor to adjust its height. Okay, width is going to increase by 2 times. Height is going to increase by 2 times in this case. So let's go take a look real fast in Web Matrix. I'm going to go ahead and open up Internet Explorer. Let's take a look here. All right, so you see that the object has increased in size. I actually have to go back and take a look at my CSS here. So if I look at scaled, oh, I didn't increase it by a factor of 2 and 2. I just increased it by a factor of 1 and 2. So now if I save that CSS file, notice that the change has occurred there. Okay. All right. So next up, we'll go ahead and rotate. Right? So you're going to go ahead and use the rotate method with the transform property and then insert the number of degrees. So I'm going to go back and add the rotated class to my transforms demo here. I'm going to launch the browser and do a quick refresh, and there you have a rotation of 45 degrees. Some pretty cool stuff, right? You have to think pretty carefully about how you want to implement these different transitions or transforms. And so, don't just do it arbitrarily. It's really important. We've also got some 3D rotations that you can do, and what happens is with these 3D rotations is you rotate it along an axis. So here we rotate along the x-axis, and notice that the shape appears a little bit smaller than it is. same thing here, but what's happening is we're rotating the shape around a particular axis, right? So we're moving it so that it appears like it has depth. Unfortunately, on a screen, sometimes it's not going to be the case. 2D skewing. You can use skewing, or rather you can skew a shape or an element by using the skew method. It's going to accept two different values. There's a number of degrees to turn the object around the x-axis, and then the number of degrees to turn it around the y-axis. And so what happens is we will have already turned this shape around, and I'm not doing a very good job of drawing there. We turn it around the y-axis and then back around the x-axis. Definitely go ahead and do a quick Bing search for this. I think that you can probably find some better animations than what I'm providing you with right now. So don't be afraid to do that, okay? All right, next, we got transitions, okay? A transition is a visible movement from one state to another on screen. And so to create a transition, you want to use the transition property and then set the value as the property that you would like to change. Okay, so we're going to change our background, and what we're going to do is that's going to occur, or we're going to implement that transition whenever we hover over an object. And I've added, whoops. I've added, notice that that hover declaration there, okay? Or sorry, I added hover to the selector, okay? So this can be done with the transition property or by using specific properties for each. I'm going to demo this in just a second, but you have transition, transition property, transition delay. Transition is a shorthand for all four of the other properties below. Definitely use the individual properties first before you go on to use transition as a shorthand. It's a great way just to make sure that you know exactly what you're doing first. Right. So let's go ahead and take a quick look and do a demo here. So I'm going to transition the background here of an element when I hover over it. Oh, transitions is already there. So we're going to do this with a button that's on the screen. Okay, you guys have probably been wondering, why is that random button there? This is why. And looks like I need to open this back up again in the browser. Oh, look at that. That's exciting. It's really exciting. Okay, so all that happens is when I hover over the button, it slowly transitions to a different color of orange. Okay. And so you can see in the CSS, what I've done is I've got my transition property. I set it as background. The transition duration is over a time period of 2 seconds. And I can go ahead, if I wanted to change this to blue, I could do that and just type the actual name for it. And then if I open this back up again, the browser, now you see that it transforms to blue. Right. All right, so next, let's talk about animations. Transforming is static. It happens. A user might not be knowledgeable of it. Animations, on the other hand, make objects or make elements on a page appear as though they're moving. And so unlike transitions, we've actually got to implement a rule here called the keyframes rule. And that allows you to adjust the timing of an animation. And so what this one's going to do is we're going to move from a blue background into a yellow highlight 50% of the way there, and then we're going to transition to red to finish out. And so our animation name here is glow, which has to be the same as the selector name, which is preceded by the keyframes rule. Okay, and this is what I was mentioning earlier and couldn't quite recall for whatever reason. But then notice that I've got my animation duration is 5 seconds. So let's go ahead and see this in action here real quickly. So I'm going to add Oh, real fast before I show you that quick demo, here are all the properties in isolation. Really important to take a look at those after you download the slides. Okay. Oh, before we move on, let's take a look at that demo real quickly. I don't know why I typed glow. I want to type animated. I'm going to save my file, and then I'm going to launch it in the browser. And look at that. We've animated the square. Went from blue to yellow to red. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you end a presentation, okay? As a quick recap for everything that we talked about today, we reviewed graphic effects, then 2D and 3D transformations. Thanks for joining me once again. I look forward to seeing you during our next module where we start talking about JavaScript.